The starship Orion drifted through the endless void, its engines humming softly against the backdrop of space's oppressive silence. It had been weeks since the crew had seen anything but the cold, distant glow of stars, and the isolation was beginning to take its toll. The ship's dim, sterile corridors were filled with an unsettling quiet that seemed to magnify every creak and whisper, as if something unseen was watching, waiting just out of sight. Captain Ellis could sense it, the same way a predator senses a storm on the horizon. Ellis stood on the bridge, staring at the vast expanse through the reinforced glass of the observation window. His tired eyes scanned the darkness, searching for anything, any hint of movement or life. But there was nothing, just the same dead, empty stretch of space they had been navigating for days. He turned away, feeling the weight of his own thoughts bearing down on him. The crew needed a break, a distraction, something to remind them they weren't just aimlessly drifting, lost in a sea of nothingness. The silence was shattered by a sudden, crackling burst of static from the communications console. The noise startled Ellis, who immediately turned to face the source. Beside him, Lieutenant Harris, the communications officer, was already adjusting the dials, trying to clear up the interference. The static hissed and popped, and then, just barely audible, a voice broke through. "Help. Stranded. Crew. Not human. Danger." Harris's hands trembled as he adjusted the frequency, trying to capture the signal. The voice was faint, distorted, as if it had been transmitted through layers of static and time. The words cut in and out like a plea struggling to make its way through the vacuum. Ellis felt a chill creep down his spine. It was a distress signal, but there was something wrong with it. It didn't sound like any standard emergency transmission. There was no identification, no coordinates, just a garbled, desperate cry for help. "Do we have a location?" Ellis asked, his voice steady but low, as if speaking louder might cause the signal to disappear entirely. "Working on it, sir," Harris replied, eyes locked on the monitor. "It's weak, but I'm getting a fix." "Got it. Transmitting coordinates now." Ellis watched as the numbers flashed across the screen, plotting a course to a region of space marked on their star maps as the dead expanse. His brow furrowed. The dead expanse was a place few ships ventured into willingly, a vast empty zone where navigation systems often malfunctioned, and whispers of strange disappearances were passed around like ghost stories among the crew. He hesitated, weighing the options. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to ignore the signal, to turn the ship around and continue their mission. But protocol was clear. Any distress call had to be investigated, no matter how suspicious it might seem. "Prepare to change course," he said, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "We're going to check it out." The crew on the bridge exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard the rumors too, but no one dared to question the captain's orders. The coordinates were locked in and the ship began to turn, its engines humming as it altered its trajectory. Outside, the stars shifted, sliding past the window like a curtain being drawn back, revealing the dark unknown that lay ahead. As they approached the coordinates, the signal grew stronger, clearer. The words were still distorted, but there was no mistaking the fear in the voice. It repeated the same fragmented phrases over and over, like a scratched record. "Help. Stranded. Crew. Not human. Danger." Each repetition sent a shiver through Ellis, like a cold hand gripping his heart. "What do you make of it?" Ellis asked Harris, who was still hunched over the console, trying to clean up the audio. "I don't know, sir," Harris replied, his voice tight with anxiety. "It sounds like a distress call, but there's something off about it. Like it's been tampered with or filtered through something." Ellis didn't like the sound of that. "Can you identify the source of the transmission? Is it coming from a ship?" "Not sure," Harris said, tapping a few more keys. "I'm picking up some kind of object. It's big, but it's not showing up in any of our databases. No transponder, no registration, just drifting." Ellis leaned over the console, studying the radar display. There it was, a faint blip against the black screen, barely detectable, like a ghost ship lost in the dark. "Put it on screen." The main monitor flickered to life, revealing a blurry image of the object. As the resolution sharpened, the crew fell silent, staring in disbelief. It was a ship, but unlike any they had ever seen. Massive and twisted, its structure was chaotic, a tangled mass of metal and cables with sharp angular shapes that seemed to jut out at odd angles. The exterior was covered in dark, rust-like patches, and strange symbols were etched into the hull, symbols that hurt to look at for too long, as if they were meant to repel anyone from coming closer. "It doesn't look human," Harris whispered, echoing the words from the distress signal. "Could it be a derelict?" asked Lieutenant Monroe, the ship's engineer, her voice betraying a hint of excitement. "A relic from one of the old exploration missions?" "Or a trap," Ellis said flatly. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken fear that had taken root in each of them. It was like the ship on the screen was calling to them, beckoning them to come closer, even as every instinct told them to turn back. "We don't have a choice," he continued, more to himself than to the others. "If there's a chance someone's still alive on that ship, we have to check it out." He knew it was a risk, perhaps even a suicide mission, but he couldn't ignore the distress call. It gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. "Prepare a boarding party," he ordered. "We'll get a closer look." As the crew began to make preparations, Ellis stared at the image on the screen, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. The ship wasn't just abandoned, it was waiting. And whatever was inside it, he had the sinking suspicion that it was far from human. The Orion drew closer to the ship, its sleek frame dwarfed by the looming, ominous silhouette of the derelict. The signal grew louder, clearer, almost frantic, as if urging them to come faster. "Help! Stranded! Crew! Not human! Danger!" Ellis clenched his jaw, steeling himself. The closer they got, the more he could feel it, a sense of dread, thick and suffocating, like the air before a storm. The void beyond the ship felt wrong, like something vast and unseen was watching, waiting for them to make their move. He glanced at the darkened corridors of his own ship, the dim lights flickering as if they too were afraid. "Whatever's on that ship," he muttered, "we're going to find out." The Orion continued its approach, and as it did, the shadows seemed to stretch, pulling them into the dark abyss where no light could escape and no one could hear them scream. The Orion hovered silently beside the derelict vessel, the two ships locked in a ghostly embrace in the void. The boarding team had assembled in the airlock, their suits sealed tight, helmets reflective and opaque, concealing the tension etched on their faces. Captain Ellis watched them from the observation deck, his unease growing. The closer they had gotten, the stranger things had become. The distress signal had begun to distort, the voice warping, stretching, like it was straining to maintain its form. Now it was a jumble of words, overlapping whispers in languages they didn't recognize. "Ready, Captain," said Monroe, her voice crackling over the intercom. The engineer's tone was calm, but Ellis could see her hands were clenched tight around the handle of her plasma cutter, knuckles white. "Understood," Ellis replied, forcing authority into his voice. "Proceed, but stay sharp. If anything feels off, you come back. No heroics." He watched as Monroe and the rest of the team, Harris, Davis, and Cortez, maneuvered their way through the airlock, connecting the umbilical passage to the derelict's docking port. The ship's exterior loomed outside the window, a jagged, twisted silhouette against the stars. Up close, it was even more unnerving than the scans had shown. The hull was covered in strange, spiraling symbols that seemed to writhe under the flickering light, patterns that made Ellis's eyes burn if he looked at them too long. It felt wrong, as if the ship was something that should not exist. A blasphemy against the natural order of space. The boarding team crossed over, their lights cutting through the pitch-black darkness that filled the other ship's corridors. The walls were rusted and scarred, patches of metal buckling and twisted, like they had been melted and reformed by some unimaginable force. Each footstep echoed, the sound hollow, swallowed by the vast emptiness around them. "Feels like a tomb," Harris muttered. "Where is everyone?" No one responded. Monroe glanced at the screens on her wrist monitor, but the readings were erratic, flickering wildly between extremes. The sensors were having trouble mapping the interior, as if the ship was shifting, changing the deeper they went. "Stay close," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Keep an eye on your oxygen levels. I don't trust this place." They moved deeper, passing through narrow passageways and corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, leading them in circles. The ship's design was chaotic, a maze that twisted and turned without rhyme or reason. Occasionally, their lights would catch glimpses of strange shapes etched into the walls, grotesque, spindly figures frozen mid-scream, their mouths wide, eyes wide, staring with an intensity that made Monroe shudder. She felt as if the walls themselves were watching, following their every move. After what felt like hours, they found the first sign of the ship's former crew. A torn uniform, stained dark and crumpled on the floor, as if the wearer had been ripped out of it. The name patch was barely legible, but the logo was unmistakable. It belonged to the Kronos, a research vessel that had disappeared over a decade ago. Harris picked up the tattered fabric, his hands shaking slightly. "This can't be right," he said. "The Kronos was lost years ago, nowhere near this sector." Ellis's voice crackled over the intercom. "What did you find?" Monroe hesitated, then spoke. "It's from the Kronos, Captain, but there's no sign of the crew, just this." Silence hung over the line, heavy and foreboding. Ellis's response was slow, measured. "Keep moving. See if you can find anything else. But be careful." The corridors led them to a vast chamber, a hollow expanse that stretched out before them like a yawning maw. The room was filled with a dense, stagnant fog that clung to their suits, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. There was no air circulation, no hum of machinery, just a deep, suffocating stillness. The walls were lined with dark, metallic conduits that pulsed faintly, like veins carrying an unseen current. "What the hell is this place?" Cortez murmured, his voice shaky. "It's like the whole ship is alive." As they stepped further into the chamber, their lights caught something glinting on the floor. Harris crouched down, wiping away the mist to reveal a scattering of tools scattered haphazardly alongside what appeared to be a maintenance log. He flipped through the pages. The ink smeared and faded, but he could make out bits and pieces, notes about energy fluctuations, structural damage, and something referred to only as the core. The entries became increasingly frantic, disjointed, until they were little more than scribbles. The last entry was a single line scrawled in jagged, desperate letters. "Do not wake it." "Wake what?" Davis asked, his eyes wide. What were they trying to... Before he could finish, a loud clang reverberated through the chamber, echoing off the metal walls. The noise was deafening, as if something had slammed against the hull with immense force. The team spun around, lights sweeping across the room, but there was nothing there. Just the fog, swirling and shifting in the cold air. "Did anyone else hear that?" Harris whispered, his breath fogging up his helmet's visor. "We heard it," Monroe said, her grip tightening on the plasma cutter. "Stay alert. Whatever made that noise is still here." They pressed on, nerves fraying, until they came to a hatch at the far end of the chamber. It was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness peeking through, and there was a faint, rhythmic sound coming from the other side. It was a soft, wet thumping, like a heartbeat, slow and steady, almost hypnotic. Monroe hesitated, her hand hovering over the hatch. "We need to see what's behind this," she said, though her voice was unconvincing even to herself. "We need answers." The hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow passage that descended into the bowels of the ship. The walls here were different, smoother, more organic, as if the metal had been fused with something living. It pulsed gently, in time with the heartbeat sound, and a dark, viscous liquid oozed from cracks in the surface, pooling around their boots. The passage led them down, twisting deeper into the ship's core, where the light barely reached, and shadows seemed to move of their own accord. They emerged into another chamber, and what they saw made their blood run cold. Dozens of pods lined the walls, each one filled with a murky, greenish fluid. Suspended inside were figures, humanoid, but wrong. Their bodies were contorted, limbs elongated, skin pale and stretched thin over twisted bones. Eyes far too large stared out at them, unblinking, filled with a silent, eternal terror. "Are these the crew?" Cortez stammered, backing away, his voice barely a whisper. "What happened to them?" "I don't think these were ever crew," Monroe said, her eyes fixed on the nearest pod. The creature inside twitched, its head turning ever so slightly, as if it could see them. "I think they were made." The realization hit them all at once, a cold, dawning horror that spread through their minds. The Kronos crew hadn't just disappeared. They had been changed, repurposed, twisted into these monstrous forms by something that had no concept of mercy or restraint. Something that had been sleeping, and now, perhaps, was waking. "Captain, we have a problem," Monroe said, her voice trembling as she tried to keep the panic from creeping in. "There's something here, something alive, and I don't think it's friendly." The response from Ellis was immediate, but his voice was distant, faint, as if there was a great, unseen distance between them. "Get out of there, now!" But as they turned to leave, the lights flickered, and the rhythmic thumping grew louder, faster. The air felt heavier, pressing down on them, making it hard to breathe. Something moved in the dark, a shadow slipping between the pods, watching them with eyes that glowed faintly, like embers in the night. And then they heard it, a voice, low and guttural, echoing through the chamber. Stay, stay, stay. The corridor behind them was no longer there. The passageway had sealed itself, leaving them trapped, surrounded by the pods and the creatures inside. The heartbeat sound was all around them now, relentless, a drumbeat that filled their minds with a single, terrible thought. You shouldn't have come. The corridors of the derelict ship had swallowed the boarding team whole, leaving only their ghostly voices crackling over the intercom. Captain Ellis paced the bridge of the Orion, the dark, swirling emptiness outside seeming to press against the ship's hull as if trying to seep in. He listened intently, straining to catch every word from Monroe, Harris, Davis, and Cortez. Each time a transmission came through, it was laced with static, warping their voices, as if the ship was trying to scramble their communication. "We need to get out," Monroe's voice hissed over the speakers, her tone sharp, on the edge of panic. "The deeper we go, the worse it gets. There's something here, Captain. I don't know what it is, but it's..." The transmission cut out, replaced by a high-pitched screeching, like nails dragging across metal, followed by that low, rhythmic hum that Ellis had heard before. He had no idea where it was coming from, but it reverberated through the walls, deep and guttural, like the sound of a massive creature stirring from sleep. Every time he heard it, he felt an irrational sense of dread, a primal fear that twisted in his gut. He grabbed the radio, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "Monroe, respond. What do you mean something's there? Are you being followed?" There was a pause, and then Monroe's voice returned, breathless, like she was struggling to breathe. "No, not followed. It's already here. It's everywhere." Deep within the bowels of the derelict, Monroe and the others moved through a maze of darkened hallways, their flashlights barely piercing the inky blackness. The walls seemed to close in around them, pulsing like a living organism, and there was a foul metallic stench in the air, as if the ship itself was rotting. It was as if the vessel was aware of their presence, twisting and reshaping to keep them from escaping. Every now and then, Monroe would catch a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision, a ripple in the darkness, a shadow that darted out of sight before she could turn her head. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but then the others began to notice it too. They were not alone. Something was watching them, circling, playing with them like a cat toys with a mouse. "Did anyone else see that?" Davis asked, his voice shaking. He swung his flashlight wildly, the beam bouncing off the warped metal walls, but there was nothing there. "I swear I saw something." "I saw it too," Cortez whispered, "like a shape moving through the walls, like it's inside them." "We need to stay together," Monroe said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. She had always been steady, reliable, but now even she was on the verge of breaking. "Just keep moving. We need to find an exit." The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor beneath their feet, and with it came the whispers. Soft, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from everywhere at once, slipping through the cracks in the walls, curling around them like invisible fingers. The whispers were in no language they could understand, but the tone was unmistakably sinister, mocking. Monroe tried to block them out, but the more she tried, the clearer they became, as if something was whispering directly into her mind. Back on the Orion, Ellis sat with his hands gripping the armrest of his chair, knuckles white. The unsettling noises coming from the derelict were beginning to seep into the Orion's systems, causing the lights to flicker, the monitors to glitch. He had thought it was a technical issue at first, but now he wasn't so sure. There was a pattern to it, A rhythm, as if the ship was responding to the derelict's presence, a silent dialogue being conducted just beyond his comprehension. "Captain," came a voice from the crew. It was Lieutenant Morgan, who had been monitoring the boarding team's vitals. "Their heart rates are spiking. They're terrified. Whatever's down there, it's getting to them." Ellis wanted to call them back, to bring them all home and get as far away from this nightmare as possible, but he couldn't. They were too deep inside, and the ship's layout kept shifting, making it impossible to navigate. If they lost their bearings completely, they would never find their way back. "Monroe, Harris, do you copy?" he said, forcing his voice to remain calm. "You need to hold it together. Describe what you're seeing." For a moment there was only silence. Then Monroe's voice came through, strained and halting, like she was forcing herself to speak. "We're in some kind of central chamber. There are cables everywhere, like veins. They're pulsing, and the walls, they're wet. It's like the ship is breathing." The team stood in the chamber, their flashlights cutting through a thick, gelatinous fog that filled the space. The room was vast, almost cavernous, with dark tendrils snaking down from the ceiling, disappearing into the floor below. The tendrils pulsed, expanding and contracting in time with the hum, like the heartbeat of some colossal, unseen creature. Monroe's head was pounding, her vision swimming. She tried to focus, but the whispers were getting louder, clearer, until they weren't whispers anymore. They were words, speaking directly to her. "You came. We called, and you came. You shouldn't have, but you did." She turned, expecting to see one of the others, but they were all staring at her, faces pale, eyes wide with fear. Did any of you just say something?" she asked, her voice trembling. They shook their heads, and Harris stepped closer, his face reflecting the same growing horror that Monroe felt. "We heard it too. But it wasn't us." The realization hit them all at once. Something on this ship was communicating with them, not through words, but through thoughts, seeping into their minds, corrupting their senses. Davis took a step back, almost stumbling, as if he could feel something crawling up his spine. "We have to go," he said, his voice barely more than a whimper. "We need to get out of here." But as he turned, a shadow peeled away from the wall, and Davis froze, his flashlight catching a glimpse of something slithering past him. The thing was barely visible, a dark, amorphous shape that moved with a sickening fluidity, like oil spilled across water. For a moment, it was just a formless black smear, but then it twisted, coalescing into a shape that was almost human, almost familiar, yet horribly wrong. Its limbs were elongated, bending at impossible angles, and its face was a blurred, featureless mask with no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, blank surface that seemed to ripple and shift. The thing stood there, silent, watching them, and as it moved closer, the whispers grew louder, deafening, filling the chamber with a cacophony of voices. "It sees us," Cortez said, barely able to breathe. "It's been watching us the whole time." Monroe raised her plasma cutter, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely aim. "Stay back," she said, her voice breaking. Stay back." The shadow tilted its head, as if considering her command, then stepped forward, and the lights around them flickered, plunging the chamber into darkness. For a moment there was nothing, just the hum throbbing louder, until it felt like it was inside their skulls, squeezing, suffocating. And then a single word cut through the noise, clear and sharp, a voice that was not their own. Stay. On the bridge of the Orion, Ellis listened, his heart pounding in his chest as the feed went silent. "Monroe, Harris, anyone, respond," he shouted. But there was no answer, just that terrible, incessant hum like a chant echoing through the speakers. And then, out of the static, he heard it, faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was the sound of breathing, heavy and wet, as if something vast and ancient was inhaling, tasting the air. The lights on the bridge dimmed, and for a moment Ellis thought he saw a shadow stretch across the observation window, a dark, shapeless mass that drifted past, disappearing into the abyss. "Captain, there's something wrong with the readings," Lieutenant Morgan said, her voice barely concealing her fear. "I'm picking up more signals, but they're not from the team. They're coming from inside our own ship." Ellis's blood ran cold. "That's impossible," he said, but even as he spoke, he could feel it. The air on the Orion had changed, thickened, like something unseen was pressing against it. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the walls, as if the derelict had reached out and laid its hands on the Orion, dragging it closer, pulling it in. "We need to bring them back," he said, but he knew deep down that it might already be too late. Whatever was on that ship had reached them, and it wasn't going to let go. The last words he heard from Monroe came through faintly, almost drowned out by the static. "It's in the walls. It's everywhere. We never should have come here." And then the line went dead. Silence had consumed the Orion. The bridge was dark, the faint glow of the monitors flickering like dying embers, casting weak, jittery light across Captain Ellis's face. The oppressive hum that had infected the ship was gone, replaced by an even more unsettling quiet, a silence that pressed down on him, suffocating, as if the void outside had reached inside and swallowed every sound. Ellis sat in his chair, gripping the armrests with white-knuckled hands, staring at the darkened screens that had once shown the frantic, distorted feeds from the boarding team. Now, there was nothing. No voices, no images. Just black, empty screens that seemed to mock him, as if daring him to look away, to abandon hope. "Monroe, Harris, Cortez, Davis, anyone respond," he whispered into the intercom, knowing it was futile. "Please." But the silence persisted, stretching out into eternity. He felt his heart pound in his chest, a rhythmic beat that sounded too loud, too deliberate, like the ship was echoing his own fear back at him. He had been trying to reach them for what felt like hours, but all he had heard were fragments, broken sentences, gasps of panic, and then, finally, nothing at all. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew what it meant, but he wasn't ready to face it, not yet. Suddenly, the main screen flickered, and a garbled image cut through the darkness. It was Monroe's helmet cam, jerking violently, the feed distorted and streaked with static. For a moment, Ellis caught glimpses of her, her eyes wide, unblinking, her face smeared with sweat, streaked with something dark. Her breathing was ragged, shallow, as if she was struggling to hold on to her last shreds of sanity. Then the camera swung wildly, and the screen was filled with movement, a flash of dark tendrils writhing, coiling around her, dragging her forward. The image blurred, but Ellis could make out something in the distance, a massive pulsating mass hanging from the ceiling of the chamber like a grotesque, living cocoon. It was covered in a tangle of cables and wires, organic and mechanical, fused into a single, nightmarish entity. And then he saw them, figures suspended in the mass, their bodies limp, pale and twisted, as if they had been drained of everything that once made them human. They were the missing crew from the Kronos, or what was left of them. Their faces were stretched, eyes hollow, mouths open in silent screams, as if trapped in an endless waking nightmare. Ellis felt bile rise in his throat, but he couldn't look away. The camera swung again, and this time it captured something far worse. The dark tendrils parted, revealing a figure more distinct than the others. It was human in shape, but barely. The limbs were elongated, contorted, the skin too pale, too tight, stretched across bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. The head was wrong, misshapen, the eyes too large and dark, like bottomless pits that seemed to draw in the light. It wasn't just watching Monroe, it was examining her, as if she was a specimen it was about to dissect. Ellis heard her voice, faint and broken, crackling over the feed. "Captain, it's not just a ship, it's alive." The screen flickered again, and the image shifted, zooming in on the grotesque figure. Ellis could see its mouth, a slit that slowly curved into a smile, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. They're not human," Monroe continued, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They never were." Ellis's breath hitched, and he forced himself to keep watching, even as every instinct screamed at him to look away. The dark figure began to move, slowly, deliberately, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic, and the camera trembled as Monroe tried to back away. But the tendrils tightened, holding her in place, and the feed went dark for a moment before a new image replaced it, one that made Ellis's blood turn to ice. It was a face. His face, staring back at him from the screen, eyes wide with terror, mouth twisted in a silent scream. But it wasn't him. The features were close but just slightly off, like a twisted parody of his own reflection, distorted and warped. The image flickered, and suddenly it wasn't just his face. It was Monroe's, and then Harris's, Davis's, Cortez's, each face blending into the next, merging, shifting, until it became clear that this thing had been studying them, mimicking them, trying to understand what it meant to be human. And then it spoke, not with a voice, but with a thought, a presence that filled the room, invading Ellis's mind. "We learned from them. We learned from you." The words echoed, cold and hollow, as if coming from a great distance. "You brought us what we needed, what we were missing." Ellis's vision blurred, and he felt a sharp pain in his temples, as if something was drilling into his skull. He could feel the thing's thoughts slithering into his mind, searching, probing, and with them came images, memories, emotions, fears. He saw the Kronos crew adrift, helpless as the derelict ship found them, consumed them, twisted them into something new. He saw flashes of faces, twisted into monstrous shapes, and then he saw his own crew, standing in the dark, their eyes vacant, hollow, as if they had been hollowed out and filled with something else. "We are not alone," the voice continued, and Ellis realized with a jolt that it was no longer speaking just to him. It was speaking through him, using his own thoughts as a conduit. "We are never alone. We are part of something greater, something infinite, and you will be too." On the screen, the feed jerked again, and Ellis saw Monroe's face, pale and glistening with sweat, her eyes wide, unblinking, as the tendrils coiled around her neck, her arms pulling her closer to the pulsating mass. "No," she said, her voice barely more than a gasp. "Please, no." And then she was gone. The screen went black, and the silence that followed was absolute, crushing. Ellis stared at the darkened monitor, his mind reeling, unable to comprehend what he had just seen. Somewhere deep within the ship, something shifted, and he felt the Orion tremble, as if the derelict was tightening its grip, pulling them closer, absorbing them. He realized with a sickening clarity that they had never stood a chance. From the moment they received the signal, they had been lured in, manipulated, guided into the trap like moths to a flame. The derelict had called to them, and they had answered, bringing themselves willingly into its grasp. It wasn't just a ship, it was a predator, an ancient, unknowable thing that drifted through the cosmos, feeding off the lives it ensnared, learning, evolving, becoming. And now, it had them. Ellis reached for the controls, his hands shaking, trying to find a way to disconnect, to sever the Orion's link to the derelict. But the systems were unresponsive, the screens flashing with error codes he didn't recognize. It was as if the ship was already part of the derelict, its systems merging, fusing into a single, living entity. Panic surged through him, and he slammed his fist against the console, desperate to do something. But it was no use. They were trapped, ensnared in the same web that had claimed the Chronos. The hum returned, louder than ever, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through his bones. And then, from somewhere deep within the derelict, a new signal began to broadcast, a message garbled and distorted, but unmistakable. It was the same distress call they had received, but now it carried new words, new voices, blending together into a single haunting chorus. Help, stranded, crew, not human, danger. Ellis realized with a cold, sinking horror that the signal was being transmitted again, broadcasting out into the void, searching for the next ship to find it. The derelict wasn't just feeding, it was calling, spreading its influence, extending its reach, and it would never stop. It would drift endlessly through the dark, silent expanse, luring others into its maw, devouring them, becoming them. As the darkness closed in around him, Ellis heard one final whisper, a voice that was not his own but spoke with his words, his thoughts. "We are not alone," it said, echoing through his mind, a soft, cold caress. "We are never alone." And then the Orion went silent, swallowed whole by the void, as the signal echoed out into the endless night, waiting, watching for the next ship to answer the call. The void was patient. It always had been, and it was hungry.